Step 1 to the pendulum squat is getting humbled real quick. So the pendulum squat is an awesome exercise. So 3 steps to performing them properly is number 1, establishing your stance. So generally speaking, your stance will likely be around the middle of the platform of the pendulum squat that you're using. Now, pendulum squats are built slightly different, so definitely feel out your stance, but ideally you want to be in a position that allows you to comfortably get a full range of motion without having your heel lift off or having to compromise your form in any way. So if you can maintain a position to where your back and hips are pressed against the pad of the pendulum squat and you get a full range of motion, that is generally a really good starting point for your stance. Generally, again, that is going to be around the middle of the platform and maybe hip width, if not a little bit wider, with your feet either forward or turned out slightly. Again, play with your positioning here. Everybody will be a little bit differently based on your limb lengths and your hip anatomy. Step 2 is to unrack the machine and stand up with the weight. So this is a time to kind of gather yourself and collect yourself and make sure you are ready for the load that you have on the pendulum squat. I usually give myself 1 deep breath or a couple of breaths to kind of get ready for my set, realign my goals, think about what I'm trying to achieve, and then I start my descent. Step 3 is the descent. So as you come down with the pendulum squat, I think one of the things that I see beginner lifters often do with this exercise is dive bomb the movement. The pendulum squat is awesome because we get an awesome resistance profile throughout the entirety of the range of motion. So as you lower yourself down, think about controlling that load in a nice even keeled tempo, maintain an even pressure on the feet through the platform, and try to keep your torso and hips pressed into the pad. Allow yourself to get that full range of motion, and then as you hit that end range of motion, try not to just sit in the hole, but try to maintain a little bit of tension throughout the lower body. This will allow you to have a smoother transition and keep more tension on the muscles that you are after. Step 4 is standing back up with the weight. So once you've hit that end range of motion, you're going to think about driving your feet evenly through the platform and standing back up. As you get to that locked out position, remember maintain a nice smooth tempo and squeeze your quads at the top. I like to use the quad squeeze cue because it helps to signal to lifters when a rep is completed. If you have to take a second to breathe, go for it. Or you can do something like a soft lockout to maintain tension and keep your reps consecutive. You can also explore that, but that is going to be brutal, and I warn you before you do it, your legs will be screaming. So 3 benefits that come along with the pendulum squat is number 1, they can be a fantastic exercise for lower body hypertrophy. The pendulum squat is awesome because you don't need a ton of weight to get a sick stimulus with them. And so if you are somebody who is wanting to work through a full range of motion to blast your adductors, quads, glutes, and even a little bit of your hamstrings and calves, the pendulum squat can be an awesome exercise to do it with. And because you're on a fixed range of motion, it can be really easy to manipulate your tempo, maintain good tension throughout your reps, and to really focus on your form and getting a full range of motion with your movement pattern. The second benefit of pendulum squats is they take off some of that spinal and axial loading that you're going to get with back squats. So I love a good barbell back squat, front squat, etc. However, if I am trying to blast my legs, and let's say my back is already fatigued from a squat day earlier in the week or deadlifts or whatever it might be, the pendulum squat can be an awesome exercise to utilize to take off some of that stress on the spine. So because you are pressing your back into a pad and your shoulders are supported in the pads as well, you're not going to have as much axial loading, so you can pursue a sick hypertrophy and strength stimulus on the legs and limit some of that overall spinal loading and fatigue. The third reason why I like pendulum squats is they can be an awesome exercise for working around injuries. Now, this is obviously very multifactorial and individual. However, if you have an injury that, let's say, is limiting you from doing a hack squat, leg press, Hatfield squat, back squat, front squat, whatever it might be, whatever you might have going on, the pendulum squat might be an exercise to implore and try to see if you can perform this variation without a ton of pain or agitation to what's going on. With the range of motion that you're working through with the pendulum squat, it can sometimes alleviate some of the pain that you might be feeling in certain areas. So if you are trying to work around an injury while still pursuing a lower body stimulus, the pendulum squat can be a good exercise to at least explore and give it on a shot to see if it will allow you to work around pain and the injury that you're currently dealing with. All right, so now let's talk about performing the pendulum squat for quads, glutes, and adductors. So if you want to bias these muscles with this exercise. So if your goal is biasing the quads, there are 2 things that you're going to want to do. Number 1, you're going to want to bring your feet down in the platform a little bit. This is going to allow you to get a greater degree of knee tracking over the toes. Basically, by doing this, you're going to force the knee to track further over the toes, which will put a greater stretch on the quads, which can lead to a greater stimulus. You're also going to want to pay attention to your stance width. Generally speaking, hip width will be a really good bet for most folks. spokes, and now when it comes to your toe angle, that will vary based on what's most comfortable for you. Set up in a position that allows you to get as much knee tracking as possible over those toes. As a bonus tip, and this is something that I often use myself, is that if you bring your feet down on the platform and you notice your heel is lifting off, wear a pair of weightlifting shoes or use heel elevation. This will put your ankle and knee into an environment that leads to better forward knee translation, and that could be a really nice tool for keeping that heel down and planted while allowing those knees to track further over the toes while getting an awesome quad stimulus. So now if your goal is targeting the glutes, there are two things you're going to want to consider. Number one, you're going to want to bring your feet up on the platform. This will generally create a greater stretch to the glute max as you descend into that full range of motion. Because your knee will track less over the toes, you're going to get a greater stretch on the hip muscles, aka the glute max. The second thing you want to think about is your stance width. Similar to the quad bias here, you're going to want to think about keeping your feet about hip width apart. Now you're going to want to play with this a little bit, but generally speaking for me, I like having about a hip width stance, and then I'll have my toes a little bit more forward for a glute variation versus a quad variation, because I find it to be a little bit more comfortable in that context when I'm trying to get a nice glute stretch, because I don't need my toes out to make sure I'm getting a full range of motion with that degree of ankle and knee flexion, because I'm going to have less with a glute bias. Now with a glute biased pendulum squat, I often find that wearing flat shoes like barefoot shoes or something like a Vans or Converse can be a really good bet. I find that having an elevated heel can kind of make my mechanics a little bit wonky regarding how I'm feeling this movement, so definitely food for thought there. Now if your goal is biasing the adductors, this can be a little dicey, so two things to keep in mind is number one, generally speaking, you'll bring your feet down just a little bit on the platform compared to your traditional setup. And now when you bring your feet down, think about having them about hip width apart. The second thing you're going to want to consider is potentially angling your toes out a little bit further than you traditionally would. This will allow you to generally get a full range of motion, and then as you're coming out of that hole with that deeper range of motion, you're going to have a little bit more internal rotation, a little bit more adductor assisting with that starting hip extension out of the hole. Now that's just what I've been playing with, that I've been feeling out, and that's been really great for my overall needs and wants. So definitely play with that variation. To be quite honest, I would rather use a leg press or a hack squat if I'm trying to bias the adductors, but the pendulum squat can be a useful tool if you can nail your setup to hit those muscles. All right guys, that wraps up this pendulum squat guide. Honestly, this has been one of my favorite exercises to implement, and I'm stoked to see more gyms buy pendulum squats for their lifters and athletes. If you have additional questions on the pendulum squat, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.